We are joined today by Air Vice Marshal Arjun Subramaniam, retired. Uh, Air Marshal Subramaniam wears many hats. He has been a fighter pilot with the Indian Air Force. He's been a military historian, a writer, and a thinker on geostrategic affairs. He's the author of two remarkable books. One is called India's Wars, a Military History, that traces the history of India's military from 1947 to 71. And more recently, he has published Full Spectrum, an account of the conflicts that India has been involved in from 1972 to the current face-off with China in Ladakh and elsewhere. Arjun, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Atul. It's great to be on the show with you.
Thank you. Arjun, we are speaking today in a certain context. We are on the eve of another anniversary of the 1971 Bangladesh War. And if you permit me, I'd like to pick your brains on various dimensions of this war. And I would start by asking you, how pivotal was this war in the evolution of the Indian armed forces? And then we'll take it from there.
Yeah. After the 1962 debacle, the Indian armed forces were on a learning curve. And midway through that learning curve was the 1965 war with Pakistan, in which several lessons were learned. But from then on, up to 1971, I think the learning curve was extremely steep. And the reason is manifold. We had decisive service chiefs. There was a continuity and a decisive defense minister. And there was a young prime minister who emerged, who had a vision for India to emerge as a power of some consequence in South Asia. So I think there were many, many reasons why the Indian armed forces developed along a steep learning curve in the aftermath of the 1965 war. And that's where it found itself on the cusp of another military action in 1971.
When you talk between 65 and 71, what specific key areas did the armed forces focus on, especially if you look at the Air Force? Between 65 and 71, what happened? And simultaneously, since it seems to be a very integrated way of modernization of the Indian armed forces, and probably doctrinally also we were changing. So what is specifically happening in the Air Force, Navy, and the Army?
Yeah, let me start off. Let me start off with the Army. With the Army, there was added punch with more number of Vijay tanks coming in. You had the PT-76 that came in and was used very, very effectively in Bangladesh. More importantly, there was a lot of thrust given to adequate stocks of ammunition coming out of the rather young ordnance factories. You had Soviet equipment coming in, and therefore there was a general beefing up of armament and structures within the Indian Army. The other thing about the Indian Army, particularly when it comes to the campaign in the Eastern Theatre, is they had a fair number of formations which were well trained and ready for operations in the area. There weren't really too many formations that moved in from the Western Theatre. There were a few of them to sort of beef up 2 Corps, 33 Corps, and 4 Corps and the 101 Communication Zone. But largely, most of the troops had acclimatized and arranged themselves around the focal point of the campaign, which was East Pakistan. Yeah. When it comes to the Air Force, there were modifications on the MiG-21. The Type 77 variant came in with an external gun, the Ka-13 missile. You had the Hunter, which was modified for extended range and better weaponry. The Canberra fleet actually went from strength to strength in terms of its operational capabilities.
Canberra with the bombers?
The Canberra bomber.
Yeah.
And you had the AN-12, an aircraft like the AN-12. Well, I just spoke to one of the old navigators from the AN-12 fleet day before yesterday, an 80-year-old Group Captain Rao, and he sort of narrated how they converted the AN-12 into a real potent bomber. It could carry almost 38 250 kg bombs. And we will talk about that later as to how the AN-12s played a very, very critical role in operations, particularly in the Western sector. And as far as the Navy is concerned, 1965, the INS Virat, the INS Vikrant was undergoing a refit. Whereas in 1971, the INS Vikrant was steaming and ready with its entire complement of aircraft. So the INS Vikrant would play a pivotal role in naval operations on the eastern seaboard. And of course,
Right.
you had the new entrants, the Kilo class or the Killer Squadron with the OSAB, the boats. So
Kilo class, I mean, just to explain to the viewer, Kilo class is the submarine fleet which comes in from the Soviet Union.
I'm talking about the Killer Squadron,
Killer squadron, sorry.
the missile boats, the missile boats that conducted the attack on Karachi on 8th and on 8th December, what's called Operation Trident. So I think there was an all-round sort of modernization of India's military inventory that played a very critical part in the final outcomes.
How crucial or critical was our partnership with the Soviet Union in this entire modernization drive?
Oh, very critical in terms of the MiG-21, in terms of the PT-76, in terms of the missile boats, in terms of the Foxtrot class submarines that came in and were operational during the time. So I think the Indo-Soviet Treaty of Friendship that was signed was a very, very critical element in giving India that comfort zone. There was this comfort zone that here was a partnership that could yield rich dividends even when the going got tough. And I think...
Yeah, please.
Yeah, tell me.
Yeah, so I thought, the geopolitical element, the fixing of that, you are being backed by a superpower, a decisive, in a way, nuance, if not a shift from the policy of non-alignment, classic non-alignment, would be a major factor in what happened in the modernization of the Indian armed forces and the outcome of the Bangladesh war. Would that be correct?
I wouldn't entirely, that would be partly correct, because I would like to attribute the final outcomes that were delivered in the 1971 war. I would attribute it entirely to the politico-military synergy that existed within India. It is to the credit of Prime Minister Indira Gandhi and the Indian government and the Indian armed forces for having worked in close coordination with, I always argue that the 1971 war or the build-up to the 1971 war was probably a classic example of what we call today a whole-of-government approach.
Right.
And the Russians did matter. They did have an umbrella, but to give too much of credit or to attribute too much to the Russians, I think would not be entirely fair.
Right. Completely agree. But just to develop on that point of jointness, whole of government approach, I think history seems to be repeating itself. We are talking about the same thing right now, and I'm not sure we are getting, we're reaching the levels we reached before 1971 war.
I think if one looks back over the last few years, the aspirations, and I have always been, I've always been a bit of a skeptic. So you must pardon me if I don't sound very, effusive about everything. But even in 1967, even in 1971, it took a bit of a knock in 1965 in order to create that kind of a synergy. In our present context, since 2014, there has been a definite aspirational move towards greater synergy and a whole of government approach, particularly when it comes to national security. It has manifested itself in many actions on the ground, whether it's starting with the cross-border strikes in Myanmar or the decisive response at Doklam, or the surgical strikes, or for that matter, even the response to an initial set of setbacks in eastern Ladakh. The response that I am particularly, if you're talking about the present context, the response that ensued with the Air Force pitching in very, very significantly in building up capacity in eastern Ladakh, with the External Affairs Minister, Dr. Jaishankar, articulating India's firm posture across the world, adequate amount of support from industry and from increasing armament stocks. So what you're saying rings a bell to say that there is a realization that the only way forward in today's complex security environment is to demonstrate and to roll out a whole of government approach, whatever be the national security contingency.
Excellent. So, going back to the Bangladesh war. Now, after the war, what was it how did the Indian Armed Forces evolve in terms not just militarily but also psychologically? Were there any specific operations during the war which sort of put the Indian Armed Forces on the next level in terms of their self-confidence and outlook in terms of a more regional approach rather than a localized approach?
Oh yes. If I were to single out one operation or one set of operations that significantly boosted the morale of India's armed forces, and not only boosted the morale, it actually demonstrated to the rest of the world that the Indian armed forces are capable of seizing the initiative. They are capable of driving home the advantage. It is this whole 1 week that resulted in the psychological collapse of Dhaka, and it was because of decisive operational leadership exercised by Lieutenant General Sagat Singh. It also demonstrated nimble strategic leadership that allowed an operational leader with tremendous amount of initiative to take that initiative to its logical outcome. And I'm talking about when Lieutenant General Sagat Singh, the Corps Commander of 4 Corps, found himself on the banks of the river Meghna and found that it was only the river Meghna that stood between him and Dhaka. He asked General Arora, his army commander in Shillong, that and this is the conversation that actually happened. Jaggi, I'm here. I'm waiting to cross. Give me the orders. Now, when he found that the orders were not forthcoming immediately, he just told the army commander that I'm going ahead with the operation. And General Arora had no real option but to concur with his corps commander to say this is a possibility. It's never been done before, but go ahead. And I'm talking about the vertical envelopment. I'm talking about the heliborne operation across the Meghna with Me Force. I'm talking about the heliborne operation to take Sylhet. So these sets of operations that finally resulted in the collapse of Dhaka demonstrated initiative and seizing the initiative of the very highest order.
Also, vertically, if you talk, there is somewhere it gets centralized in a way in terms of strategic planning of the Dhaka operation. That how would you credit Sam Manekshaw, the chief of army staff, and the other chiefs in synergizing that kind of a bold and a very audacious strategic planning, which led to a situation which General Sagat Singh and all confronted with. So at a higher level, how was it going in terms of strategic planning?
Oh, that's That was something actually that it's very important to mention here. In March 1971, when Prime Minister Indira Gandhi suggested to General Manekshaw that the time to intervene in Bangladesh has come, and so is it possible to go in immediately into Bangladesh? And this was March-April. And Sam Manekshaw consulted, Army headquarters, particularly the Directorate of Military Operations. He consulted with his fellow chiefs. And I have a very interesting anecdote in my book that reveals the systematic, and even if you say cautious initial planning towards the operation that resulted in the Indian Armed Forces being able to deliver a decisive blow in December. Now, Sam Manekshaw visited the MO sometime in March, and in the presence of the Vice Chief, the Director General of Military Operations, there was a young major, not young really, a major who was on the threshold of becoming a lieutenant colonel and commanding his engineer regiment, who was in charge of logistics and looking at how well the Indian Army was stocked for combat. And he, and this is Major Pandit, who later on became a lieutenant general, and I write about it in the piece also. He told Sam Manekshaw very, very categorically that, look, we are not ready to go in a manner that you will be able to achieve a decisive outcome. So Sam Manekshaw looked at everybody else and said, is that so? And they concurred with the major, and the major told him that, so if you were to go now in the next month or two, we will be able to go in only from one direction, and that is the east. That's from Calcutta side. He said you will not be able to move in from the north, and you will not be able to move in from the west. And that is when Manekshaw and then Manekshaw was worried about two more.
What was the reason? Why not move from the west and the north? What has happened?
Because to support 101 communication zone, which was moving in from the north, and 4 Corps from the west, a lot more stocking had to be done. Airfields had to be readied because, ultimately the Indian Air Force had 9 airfields surrounding Bangladesh that were operationally fit to take fighter operations, right from Agartala to Panagarh. All this was in the process of being developed. And the only formation, if I'm not wrong, that could have gone in was, I think, 33 Corps or 2 Corps right from Calcutta. But ultimately, when the army went in, they had 4 formations going in together. 33 Corps, 2 Corps, 4 Corps, and 101 communication zone. There were 9 airfields and 12 squadrons that had been amassed against Bangladesh. All this could have been done only through systematic and deliberate planning, which those 6 months gave the services.
And it is great, also on the part of the higher leadership to listen to the juniors. I mean, it's a major, and here's the army chief, and the army chief concurs with the advice of somebody who's so junior to him. I think that itself shows the maturity and any lack of arrogance coming from the higher leadership. While doing your planning.
No, in lighter vein, let me tell you, amongst the 3 chiefs, Sam was the dominating figure, right? Yeah. Right. And therefore, it is to Air Chief Marshal Lal and Admiral Nanda's credit that they were able to strike a balance, and they were able to strike a close relationship with Sam and be able to synergize operations. So I think what you're saying is absolutely true. Sam, on his part, much older than older than the others, and chief of predominantly the largest force. No, I think it was a marvelous display of jointness.
What were the main pivotal moments in the Bangladesh war? You talked about the attack on Dhaka. What are the others which is going on? You mentioned during this conversation about the missile boat attack on Karachi. So just run us through some of these vital pivotal moments which got us this decisive victory.
Okay. let me look at, I think the first pivotal set of events was the creation of the Mukti Bahani. Let's be very,
Yes.
let's be fair, and we need to give oodles of credit to the Mukti Bahani for helping the Indian Army shape the environment before the balloon actually went up. And here again, if the Indian Army had gone into Bangladesh in April or say May, what Sam Manekshaw was worried about was he was worried about getting bogged down by the monsoon. Because in the monsoon, I've seen photographs, the Meghna and the Padma rivers, actually you can't see the far bank.
Oh.
And that is what General Shami Mehta, who was a squadron commander in the leading element of PT-76 tanks, he said that even in December when we crossed the Meghna, we couldn't see the other side. So you can imagine if the Indian Army had got bogged down in Bangladesh in the month of May, June during the pre-monsoon, it would have been a no-go.
Yep.
The other thing that Manekshaw was worried about, which may have been a little, over the top, but that was that he was waiting for the snows to come in the Himalayas, so that any possibility of the Chinese intervening, should things go bad for the Pakistanis, should that come in. So that was a far-sighted proposition.
Absolutely. Really.
But it speaks volumes for General Manekshaw's foresight and his ability to anticipate events.
Yes.
You must remember that he was bound to anticipate that because he had served for a long time as Eastern Army commander. If you recollect, Defense Minister Chavan actually moved him from Western Army Command to Eastern Army Command because he felt that the Chinese would be the next major challenge, and he wanted Sam Manekshaw to sort of look after that particular region. So the creation of the Mukti Bahani was the first decisive moment, and what the Mukti Bahani did was that they acted as the eyes and the ears of the Indian Army as they moved in. In today's parlance, actually, they provided hard intelligence of troop movements, of troop locations, of likely target systems. They did hit and run attacks against Pakistani establishment, lowering their, causing tremendous amount of psychological degradation. So that was one moment. The second critical moment was when several localized actions ensured that Pakistani brigades were not allowed to fall back towards Dhaka. That was the original plan. The original plan was that in case the Indian Army was to gain, any army would do that. In case an adversary is gaining an advantage, then formations pool inwards in order to offer a last stand or something like that. But here, what General Niazi had did was he had ordered all his commanders to fight fortress-like battles individually. So you had Kamalpur and Jamalpur, you had Sylhet, you had all these formations fighting individual battles and not being able to combine their strengths together. And that is why you had 93,000 troops surrendering in various cantonments.
And how did we take advantage of this sort of dispersion of forces which was taking place from the Pakistani side?
Exactly what General Sagat Singh did. He used smaller forces to outflank these static defenses and then cause immense amount of pressure at one center of gravity, which emerged as Dhaka.
Right.
And then the third operation was the Tangel Airdrop. The Tangel drop was just over a battalion strong. But the misinformation campaign made it appear as though it was a brigade-sized drop. So Niazi thought that it was a brigade that had been dropped at Tangel, whereas actually it was it was slightly over only a battalion.
And how were the airdrop? How does the Air Force come in here? Because that's curious.
50 aircraft, 50 transport aircraft from the Indian Air Force were used. Packets, AN-12s, a whole lot of them. They were escorted by NATO. So it was a massive operation. And
This is
Yeah,
possible only if you have already established complete air superiority. When was
yeah,
that done?
exactly. Exactly. And to be fair, the Pakistan Air Force had just one squadron in Dhaka,
Oh, okay.
and the Indian Air Force had almost 11 or 12 squadrons that took just about 3 or 4 days to establish complete air superiority.
Ah, okay.
And don't forget another event which is very, very important, not to leave the Navy behind. The aircraft carrier Vikrant exerted tremendous pressure on the Chittagong area. So there was a complete blockade of East Pakistan, thanks
Oh,
to this carrier battle group. Aircraft from the INS Vikrant caused tremendous amount of damage at Chittagong, at Chalna, at Khulna, and all these riverine ports. It was actually an all-round display
and
of military might.
then how do you what was the importance really of the Karachi attack in this entire scenario?
Oh, Karachi attack on the western seaboard. There again, it was an audacious attack because if you look at the distance from Porbandar, these missile boats were towed all the way to Porbandar, and then these high-speed boats, they were let loose with missiles against the Karachi Kiamari oil refineries, the Karachi port. It sunk a few ships. It completely shell-shocked the Pakistani establishment. And from then on, there was absolutely no naval opposition on the western seaboard.
And also the psychological dimension when the commercial capital of a nation is attacked with impunity. I think that leads a tremendous psychological blow to the opposite side. So apart from the material damage, to the psychological damage which the Karachi attack probably had caused, went along in the decisive victory that was registered in 1971. We
Yeah.
agree?
No, I completely agree. And what aggravated that psychological impact was around the same time as the Indian Navy's missile boats were hitting Karachi, there were Indian Air Force Canberras and Hunters which also were attacking the same target. And there's a very interesting anecdote is that neither the army and the Air Force and the Navy did not know that the other service was attacking the same target. So it was more by accident that finally when the damage was analyzed, the Air Force said, "Hey, we were over this target too at the same time."
What
So
was
they
the
were
strategic objective of this kind of a coordinated attack on Karachi? Was it to lock down Pakistani forces in the west, and which would ease away in the east? Why do this at such a scale, apart from the psychological and material
No,
damage?
like you mentioned, was the economic capital
Yes.
of and it was where the Pakistani fleet was located. So it was logical that if the Navy wanted to do anything meaningful on the Western Front, it had to go and attack the Pakistan Navy because being the smaller force, the Pakistan Navy, except for sending its submarines, the INS Ghazi, on a fairly long mission, otherwise the Pakistanis had no intentions of leaving port because they knew
Right.
that they would be outfought on a high sea battle with the Indian Navy. So the Indian Navy had to take the initiative and make the first move, and that's what it did.
Right.
And that's what it did with a relatively low risk operation.
Right. Why do you say low risk?
Yeah. You see, it kept its carrier away from the Western Fleet, from Karachi. None of its major battleships went close to Karachi, but it was these missile boats, relatively inexpensive, nimble, couldn't be picked up too easily on radars. They went in quickly, conducted that strike, and exited with no losses at all. That's why Operation Trident is, for the time, was quite a spectacular operation. And if you recollect, there was a similar operation carried out, by the Israelis.
I see. Which was that? I'm just getting curious.
No, it was it was these against the Egyptians.
Okay, right. Right. Arjun, looking at the bigger picture now, uh, do you see the 71 war, the Bangladesh liberation, as the arrival of India as a regional power?
I here again, I don't think we would be able to definitely state that India arrived after the 1971 war as a regional power, because India had several problems of its own even at that time. There was no way in which. So, if you were to say India arrived as a regional military power, I would say yes. But if one were to look at it holistically, India had miles to go before it could consider itself to have been a regional power, because the economy was still in doldrums.
No, the reason I say is that if I remember right, Henry Kissinger came to India after the war, and it was the Americans who said that India has now become a regional power. But I agree with you that leave aside what labels the Americans give us, but if we evaluate, then militarily we had arrived as a regional power, but as a regional power in a holistic sense, in an economic sense, and even in a political sense,
Yeah.
we were still miles away from achieving that objective.
We were still emerging. We were still emerging as a robust democracy. Just you're very right when you say that we need to set benchmarks for ourselves.
Yes, true.
If you recollect, a few years ago, Hillary Clinton made this comment that India is on the threshold of becoming a leading power.
True.
And that's when there was a lot of pushback from India itself to say that, look, India's got a long way before it can consider itself to be a leading power because of X, Y, and Z. So yes.
Yeah. But interestingly, is there a link between the Bangladesh war and what India achieved and the visit of Henry Kissinger, a visit of Richard Nixon to China in 1972? Because it was the Pakistanis which were, we played behind the scenes role of getting that visit off ground. Was there a threat on a global level now that with India and Soviet Union on one side and geopolitically China on the other side, so China, Russia, and US axis would be the one which would balance it. So did this have an impact on this bigger picture? And I'm very curious what you think about the 72 visit facilitated by the Pakistanis of Richard Nixon to China.
Oh, I would not attach when the United States leveraged Pakistan's closeness to China to set up or to freeze, to thaw relations between the United States and China. India never really figured anywhere in the calculus.
I see.
It was absolutely clear that President Nixon's outreach to China was solely targeted at the Soviet Union.
Soviet Union. But since Soviet Union and Indians were allies, we sort of get caught up in that larger matrix. Because here, geographical position of India and Soviets together would, this is also a time when the Soviets and the Chinese had fought, and they had fought on the Usuri River in 1969. Yeah. So if you are a Chinese, you would see that India not in isolation, but India is part, from their point of view, of part of a bigger alliance with a superpower. And to counter that, from the Chinese point of view, it would make complete sense to ally with the United States.
I'm sure that would have figured in the Chinese calculus. But Atul, you've been in China. As to, did India really matter to the Chinese until very recently? That's the question. That's the question we need to ask. Very rarely have the Chinese ever expressed their apprehension or their recognition of India as a rival or as a threat until very, very recently that it is done with its actions. So if you go back to 1971 and 72, it must have figured in the calculus. But I am certain about one thing, that the reasons why the Chinese agreed to this outreach initiative from the United States was with a 50-year perspective of learning from the United States, so that at one time it could topple the United States as the world's leading power. And I think that was the driving factor between the 1972 thaw between India and between the United States and China. China, even at that time, had only one goal.
Right. Finally, Arjun, we have the Act East policy, and Bangladesh becomes a very pivotal part of this policy. The access it gives to Southeast Asia. So, would you say that the foundations of what we can do today, the opportunity of Act East policy, really came about with the emergence of Bangladesh in the 71 war?
Oh yes, of course. I mean to say, I'm sure in 1971, our political leaders must not have thought about it this way. But as we see Bangladesh emerging right now, I think Bangladesh can well be called as the near pivot of our Act East policy.
Right.
And
please go ahead.
Pardon? Yeah.
Please go ahead.
And I think there are huge stakes for India in building on this relationship with Bangladesh, and of course the other nations in that particular region, like Myanmar and Sri Lanka, and for that matter even Thailand. But Bangladesh, to my mind, remains the pivot for India's Act East policy.
Thank you so much, Arjun, for your insight. It's such a pleasure talking to you, and look forward to more such quote-unquote encounters. We take the story forward.